Welcome back to the Surrey Hills. This edition of the technique feature, we're going to be looking at one of the fundamental skills in mountain biking, and for me, where it all starts really, and that's footwork. There are options in terms of your kit, but how you use your feet is really important even on a basic trail, but more so as the trail gets more and more technical. Whether it be controlling the bike through rocky sections, up over obstacles, or when you're up in the air, a lot of it stems from your feet. Familiar with the system that we use in terms of breaking down riding, we'll be able to identify with the 3 tiers: physical, psychological and the personal. The personal tier refers to you and your equipment, and essentially when it comes to footwork, 2 very obvious components to think about: the pedal itself and the type of shoe you're riding. Obviously we've got flat pedals, or we can choose one form or another of being attached to the bike and clipping in. Back in the day that might have been a big cage that you slipped your whole foot into, but these days much more likely to be a cleat on the bottom of a shoe of some form, helping you to gain extra contact with the bike and feel more attached. Flat pedals come in various shapes and sizes, profiles, etc. Perceived advantage of a flat pedal: obviously if you're slightly less confident, learning something new, riding more technical terrain than you used to, is the ability to remove your foot from the pedal. Generally speaking, however, this is kind of a safety net that we don't want to really use. Slamming your foot down isn't really part of mountain biking. Trying to keep your feet on the pedals has probably got its advantages. But you can certainly start to shuffle your foot around in terms of fore and aft. You can rotate pressure through your foot slightly more in a more varied manner than you can when you're clipped in. And certainly it will give some people more confidence knowing that they can stop, put their foot down whenever they like to, and therefore gives them one less worry or to think about, one less level of anticipation to deal with, which when it gets technical, the last thing you need to be doing is thinking about whether you can put your foot down or not. You actually want to be concentrating with all of your brain on the trail ahead and not be worrying about how easy it is to get stick your foot down should the worst come to the worst. Other added advantages is obviously generally you can switch your footwear around a bit more easily. You don't need a specific pair of shoes with a cleat on the bottom, and between riding, while you're getting your kit ready, etc., walking around can be a lot more comfortable in something that's a bit more bendy. But obviously there are those that prefer to be clipped in, and there are some advantages there to be gained. So the precise design and system of clipping in might change slightly between manufacturers. There are some dominant players there, and a vast majority of riders will fall into one of 2 types of clip in. The obvious advantage here is, or perceived advantage, is that you've got a really solid contact with the bike. You won't get bounced off your pedal so easily. That's something we're going to look at later on in terms of how to control your feet so that you don't bounce around. But obviously, clipped in, we've got a nice secure platform. That platform can be quite a lot smaller and therefore save some weight in a lot of cases. We can alter the amount of tension on the cleat, so to make it easier or harder to clip in and clip out, depending on our confidence levels. And again, we need to look at some detail there at a later stage. There's a little bit of a centre ground from the minimalistic clip-in to the big fat flat pedal, and that's a clip-in system with a bit of a platform around it. We're going to look at those a little bit later, but ultimately there is some advantage there in terms of over a clip-in on its own, in terms of ease of finding the cleat perhaps and support around your foot, and then for the style of shoe that you can wear to accommodate that pedal can vary slightly more. But there are some pitfalls there as well, which we'll highlight a bit later on. But ideally, either type of pedal, everything's going to work from the ground up. And having selected your pedal type, we need to look at perhaps the next link in the chain, which is the footwear that you're using to connect with that pedal. So a shoe with a cleat comes in many shapes and formats, from a pretty stiff and rigid, almost cross-country effect shoe, where a lot of the no power is going to be lost in the bending of the sole as we push pressure through the pedal. We've got a fairly small contact point there with the bike, and a fairly rigid shoe, which for some can prove a little bit restrictive and uncomfortable. In the middle ground, we've got a cleated shoe, perhaps better for a platformed pedal. There is a bit more give in those. They're a little less stiff, and there's a little bit more roll on them on the sole, so that actually the platform plays a big part in the process as well as clipping in. Final option is a shoe or boot designed purely for flat pedals like these here. what we've got there is a nice flat sole. You don't need to ride a specific shoe with flat pedals, but one of the big considerations is nothing with too much of an arch. Bearing in mind this is your primary point of contact with the bike, we want to make sure pedal and shoe have as much contact together as possible. An old running shoe with a big arch in there restricts where you can put your foot and can cause issues when things become technical. Obviously a boot or shoe that's designed purely for the purpose of riding a flat pedal with a bit more free ride or technical terrain in mind is going to have a little bit more cushioning in the sole than perhaps your rigid shoe, which doesn't. The sole also, as well as being good for absorbing the pins on a flat pedal, tends to have quite a good tackiness to it. Once you're in place on a good quality flat pedal with a good quality shoe designed for a flat pedal, the amount of movement around on the pedal is very limited. In fact, you might have to find yourself sitting right down, putting all your weight through your backside onto your saddle before you can lift your foot off the pedals and reposition it, should you set off with your feet in a slightly incorrect position. In terms of your exact position of your foot in the pedal, obviously a cleated system dictates that, and you can't shift it around once you're clipped in. The alignment of the cleat can change how you feel about the connection with the bike. Very few people walk with their feet exactly in line, hence so. A lot of people will either walk a little bit toes in or a little bit toes out, a bit more cowboy. The cleat, if set up exactly straight, will hold your foot in a position that you're perhaps not used to having it in. So when you pedal, it can put extra stress on certain parts of your joints that you might not be used to. So when setting up your cleats, just place your foot on the pedal in your normal riding position to feel how much toe out or toe in you normally stand or ride, and then set your cleat up accordingly. That will make things a lot more comfortable, a lot more what you're used to in terms of the stresses and strains your body has taken over the years. So back to basics in terms of the setup of a cleated shoe. There is a level of compromise here. Obviously, in terms of if you're a bit more nervous and thinking you're going to be needing to put your foot down and you don't want to suffer from the old slow speed roll over every time you pull over, or you've got a fear that you might need to put your foot down, you're going to want a nice easy release from your pedal. However, that nice easy release when you want it to happen could also equate to an unexpected release when you least want it to happen, your foot slipping off the pedal or your cleat becoming unattached. Now, as you're riding down a technical section, if your foot becomes detached and then you try and get it back on, your mind can be all over the place in terms of thinking about getting your foot back on rather than the trail ahead, and this can lead to issues. So practice, if you're new to cleats, the simplicity of getting your foot in and out. Like any technique, when we become flustered, the simple becomes more complicated. So get used to the cleated system, perhaps stationary, perhaps on some easy terrain, when you don't have to get out rather than when you do have to get out. Okay, so we can adjust the tension on most cleated systems to grip harder around the cleat, whether it be an SPD system or an egg beater or something else, some other variety of clipping. We can adjust that tension level. And realistically, I want it to give quite a good grip. For me, as an analogy in terms of skiing, you wouldn't ride around with your bindings so loose that you can just pop out of them at any stage. Think about actually the need to unclip out of a ski boot is when you crash, making sure your ankle doesn't break in event of falling off. And to be honest, you can go pretty strong on these before that is going to happen. Tighten them up, make sure that you can still get out when you need to, but you're not just going to slip off them. The beauty of a stiff carbon shoe, lots of power is there, but once you're out of that pedal you have not got much platform to stand on, so bouncing around is going to happen. Overall though, consider that putting your foot down is really the last thing you do on a mountain bike when you stop, or as an emergency save-all once your bike is slipping away from underneath you. So planning for failure by having your cleats loose is probably not the best plan.
So like we looked at on the cleat shoe, where the cleat is on the pedal fore and aft, we can do that on a flat shoe as well. So we want to think about putting the ball of our foot on the flat shoe just in front of the axle of the pedal. This means, like on the cleat shoe, that you can drive down, dropping your heels, and it's a more direct drive instead of being on your toe where you've got a really long way to get your heel down. If your toe's too far forward on the pedal, when you go to drop them heels, it's really easy to slip off, and that can cause your shins to be cut up.